midday sun over Bali is a heavy, humid blanket. But at the entrance of the St. Regis, a different chill is taking hold. A taxi driver stands frozen, staring at a massive suitcase abandoned by a young American heiress. It is far too heavy for clothes. Then he sees it, a dark, viscous liquid weeping from the zipper, staining the pristine pavement. Inside is not a luxury souvenir, but the battered remains of a Chicago socialite, stuffed into the luggage by her own daughter. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. To understand the brutality of Room 317, one must first step back into the quiet, tree-lined streets of Oak Park, Illinois, a place where wealth is whispered, not shouted. This was the world of Sheila von Wiese-Mack, a woman whose life was a masterclass in intellectual and social climbing. She was a scholar, a former staffer for Ted Kennedy, and a fixture in Chicago's elite circles. A woman who had spent decades curating a life of absolute refinement. Her husband, James Mack, was the gravity that held their world together. A legendary composer, arranger, and conductor, James was a titan in the music industry, possessing a creative intellect that commanded respect in every room he entered. When their daughter, Heather, was born in 1995, she was the crown jewel of their affluent existence, the miracle child of a late-in-life marriage who wanted for nothing. The Mack residence on Linden Avenue was more than just a home. It was a fortress of privilege, filled with the sounds of classical music and the scent of old money. But the foundation of this golden life began to crumble in 2006. During a family vacation to Greece, James Mack, the family's protector and the primary source of Heather's adoration, passed away suddenly from a pulmonary embolism. At just 10 years old, Heather's world didn't just change, it shattered. For Sheila, the loss was a double-edged sword. She was now a grieving widow and the sole custodian of a daughter who was increasingly becoming a stranger. In the years that followed, the Linden Avenue house transformed from a sanctuary into a site of domestic warfare. The transition of Heather Mack from a privileged schoolgirl to a volatile adolescent was not a slow burn, but an explosion. By the time Heather entered her teenage years, the local police were no longer strangers to the Mack household. In fact, they were practically regulars. Between 2004 and 2014, records indicate that officers were called to the home a staggering 86 times. These weren't simple teenage tantrums or minor disagreements about curfews. The calls detailed a harrowing pattern of domestic terror. Sheila reported being punched, bitten, and pushed. In one particularly chilling incident, Heather was accused of breaking her mother's arm. On another occasion, she reportedly bit Sheila so hard it left a permanent mark. The violence was often triggered by the most mundane of restrictions, a refused request for money, a question about her whereabouts, or an attempt by Sheila to set a boundary. Behind the elegant facade of their social standing, Sheila was living in a state of perpetual fear. She told friends and responding officers that she was terrified of her own daughter, describing a girl who seemed to possess a cold, detached rage that Sheila could neither understand nor control. Despite the bruises and the broken bones, Sheila remained trapped in a cycle of maternal hope and enabling. She would call the police in a moment of crisis, only to decline pressing charges once the adrenaline faded. She was a woman trying to save a daughter who was already slipping into a dark, narcissistic abyss. As Heather grew older, the conflict shifted from physical outbursts to a more calculated financial desperation. Heather knew that upon her mother's death, she would stand to inherit a trust fund valued at over $1.5 million. This wasn't just pocket change. It was the key to a life of total autonomy, free from Sheila's fretful supervision. The dynamic in the house became a poisonous mix of Heather's entitlement and Sheila's desperate attempts to buy her daughter's love with luxury items and international travel. By 2013, the atmosphere was reaching a terminal velocity. Heather had begun to associate with a local high school dropout named Tommy Schaefer, a young man who shared her penchant for luxury but lacked the means to achieve it. To Sheila, Tommy wasn't just a bad influence, he was the catalyst for her daughter's final descent. She saw the two of them together as a toxic symbiosis, two people who viewed Sheila not as a person, but as an obstacle standing between them and $1 million payday. The local community watched from the sidelines, hearing the sirens and seeing the squad cars parked outside the Mack home with disturbing frequency. Rumors of the rot inside the mansion began to spread through the elite circles of Oak Park. People wondered how a woman as brilliant as Sheila could lose control so completely. But no one truly understood the depth of the darkness taking root. Heather Mack wasn't just a rebellious teen anymore. She was a young woman who had realized that her mother was worth far more to her dead than she ever was alive. The entry of Tommy Schaefer into Heather Mack's world wasn't a romance. It was a high-velocity collision. To the elite circles of Oak Park, Tommy was a ghost from a different reality. A high school dropout with a thin resume, a penchant for expensive streetwear, and a reputation for volatility that seemed to perfectly mirror Heather's own internal storm. He was an aspiring rapper who spent more time cultivating an image of success than achieving it. And in Heather, he found a woman who didn't just admire his rebellion, she was willing to fund it. Sheila von Wiese-Mack saw the change in her daughter immediately. The girl who had been drifting since her father's death was suddenly tethered to something far more dangerous. Sheila viewed Tommy not as a boyfriend, but as a catalyst for Heather's worst impulses. To her, he was the embodiment of everything she had tried to shield Heather from, a man who viewed the Mack legacy as a lottery ticket rather than a heritage. The relationship quickly settled into a toxic symbiosis. It was fueled by Sheila's money and a shared us-against-the-world delusion that cast Sheila as the villain in a melodrama of their own making. Heather would demand exorbitant amounts of cash for designer clothes, high-end dinners, and investments into Tommy's music career. When Sheila attempted to tighten the purse strings, the fortress on Linden Avenue became a literal combat zone. We have to look closely at those 86 police calls mentioned earlier, because they tell the story of a decade-long siege. The officers of the Oak Park Police Department grew to know the Mack residents better than their own precincts. They knew which floorboards creaked and exactly which room Sheila would be hiding in when the shouting started. These weren't just calls about noise or teenage rebellion. They were reports of a mother being trapped in her own home. Officers documented Sheila with bruises on her neck, scratches on her face, and a haunting, hollow look in her eyes that spoke of a woman who had realized her daughter was no longer a child, but a predator. In one of the most chilling documented incidents, Sheila reported that Heather had broken her arm during a struggle over a cell phone. The scholar, the woman who had worked in the highest levels of American politics, was being physically dismantled by her own flesh and blood. Yet the enabling continued. Sheila would call for help in the heat of the moment, but when the sirens faded and the paperwork was presented, she would refuse to press charges. She was caught in a maternal trap, believing that one more vacation, one more expensive gift, or one more gesture of reconciliation would finally bring her daughter back from the brink. By early 2014, the stakes reached a terminal velocity when Heather discovered she was pregnant. For a 19-year-old with no employment and a boyfriend who lived at home with his mother, this should have been a moment of profound crisis. Instead, for Heather and Tommy, the pregnancy was a tactical pivot. It was the ultimate leverage. Heather kept the news hidden from Sheila for weeks, whispering about it to Tommy in the dark of her bedroom while her mother sat alone downstairs. To the young couple, this unborn child wasn't a new life. It was a new reason to demand the $1.5 million trust fund that Sheila held behind a wall of legal requirements. The trust fund, established by James Mack, was intended to be Heather's safety net, but it had become her obsession. Sheila had made it clear that Heather would only receive the full amount if she demonstrated stability and a willingness to separate herself from Tommy's influence. To the couple, this wasn't parental guidance, it was financial kidnapping. Their private text messages from this period reveal a cold, clinical detachment. They referred to Sheila as a bitch and an obstacle. They began to fantasize about a world where the gatekeeper was gone, and the money was finally theirs to spend on a life of international luxury. The psychological rot was total. Tommy and Heather didn't just want the money, they felt they were being persecuted for wanting it. The pregnancy added a frantic, ticking clock element to their greed. They needed the resources before the baby arrived, and they were tired of waiting for Sheila to do the right thing and die. The tension inside the home was so thick, it was almost tactile. The smell of Tommy's cigarettes, which Sheila had forbidden, often wafted through the vents, a constant reminder to the mother that she had lost control of her own sanctuary. In a final, desperate attempt to save her daughter and perhaps her own life, Sheila proposed a trip to Bali in August 2014. She sold it as a reconciliation tour, a chance for the two of them to escape the toxicity of Chicago and find a way back to each other in the lap of luxury at the St. Regis. Sheila paid for everything: the first-class flights, the sprawling suite in Nusa Dua, the fine dining. She believed she was buying a second chance, but Heather was already steps ahead. Using her mother's stolen credit card data, Heather secretly purchased a $12,000 business class ticket for Tommy Schaefer, while Sheila was packing her elegant resort wear, thinking of sunsets and peace. Heather and Tommy were finalizing a different kind of itinerary. Tommy wasn't going to Bali to vacation. He was going there to finish what had started in Oak Park. The three of them were now on a collision course with a tropical paradise that would soon become a slaughterhouse. Sheila arrived in Bali first, enjoying a few days of deceptive calm with her daughter. They lounged by the pool and ate at world-class restaurants. Sheila even emailed friends back home, telling them that things seemed to be improving, that Heather was finally softening. She had no idea that Tommy was already in the air, crossing the Pacific with a heart full of resentment and a plan that would leave the silver suitcase at the St. Regis stained with a bloodline that had finally reached its breaking point. The St. Regis Bali Resort is a labyrinth of marble, manicured gardens, and absolute whispered discretion. It is a place designed to make the outside world disappear. A gilded cage where the staff is trained to anticipate a guest's every whim before they even speak. On the night of August 12th, 2014, the air in Nusa Dua was thick with the scent of tropical rain and blooming hibiscus. But inside Suite 317, the atmosphere was reaching a terminal, suffocating pressure. Sheila von Wiese-Mack sat in the room she had paid for with the intention of healing her family, unaware that her executioner was currently moving through the hotel's corridors, funded by her own stolen credit card. Tommy Schaefer had arrived in Bali like a shadow, a ghost in a designer sweatshirt who had no business being in a five-star resort. He had checked in under a cloud of secrecy, his presence known only to Heather. For the first few hours, the couple played a high-stakes game of hide-and-seek, whispering in the dark while Sheila occupied the main area of the suite. But the deception couldn't hold. The truth exploded in the early hours of August 13th, when Sheila realized that Tommy hadn't just followed them to Indonesia. He was standing in her very sanctuary. The confrontation that followed was not a sudden burst of passion, but the violent conclusion of a decade of domestic rot. The walls of Suite 317 became a pressure cooker. Sheila reportedly confronted the pair about the secret pregnancy, the stolen funds, and the absolute betrayal of the reconciliation trip. She told them, with the clarity of a woman who had finally reached her limit, that the money was finished, that Tommy would never see a cent of the Mack estate, and that Heather's future was now shackled to a man who was nothing more than a common thief. In that narrow hallway between the elegant furniture and the pristine white linens, the tension finally snapped. Tommy didn't reach for a knife. He didn't have a gun. He reached for the nearest heavy object, a decorative metal fruit bowl. It was a piece of hotel luxury, a heavy, cold item meant to hold tropical fruit for the elite. And it was about to become an instrument of slaughter. The first blow was a sickening, hollow thud. Sheila didn't have the chance to scream. The metal struck her with the concentrated force of years of Tommy's resentment and Heather's greed. She fell against the bed, her white resort wear beginning to bloom with deep, crimson stains that the high-end laundry service would never be able to remove. Tommy did not stop at one blow. He struck her again and again, a frenzied, rhythmic assault. The autopsy would later reveal the sheer brutality of the attack: a fractured skull, a broken nose, and defensive wounds on her hands that proved Sheila had fought with everything she had left to ward off the man her daughter loved. During the struggle, the room was a blur of violence. Forensic evidence would later paint a chilling picture of Heather's involvement. While Tommy swung the metal bowl, some accounts suggest Heather was not merely a bystander. She was an anchor. There were indications that she helped pin her mother down, perhaps muffling her cries or ensuring she couldn't escape the hallway. The miracle child watched as the woman who had given her a life of unimaginable privilege was systematically dismantled. Then, the silence returned to room 317. The only sound was the hum of the expensive air conditioning and the heavy, ragged breathing of two killers. Sheila von Wiese-Mack, the scholar who had navigated the halls of power in Washington, lay dead on the floor of a vacation paradise. The obstacle had finally been removed, but the relief they expected didn't come. In its place was the cold, clinical pressure of the aftermath. The room was a slaughterhouse. Blood was sprayed across the marble and the white upholstery. Tommy looked down at his hands, which were sliced and bruised from the ferocity of the attack. They didn't call the police. They didn't scream for help. They began to work. They spent the next several hours in a state of gruesome pragmatism. They used hotel towels to mop up the blood, but it was useless. The volume was too great. They realized they couldn't stay in the room, and they couldn't leave the body behind. Their eyes fell on the massive silver suitcase that Sheila had brought to hold her designer wardrobe. It was the only vessel large enough for their needs. What followed was a scene of pure horror. The body was still warm, but the suitcase was not designed for a human occupant. They began the task of packing Sheila. It was a physical impossibility made real by the adrenaline of a looming death sentence. They broke her bones. They folded her limbs at unnatural angles. They pushed and shoved with a desperate, frantic energy. They were trying to fit a life into a piece of Samsonite. The silver casing began to bulge. The zipper groaned under the strain of the weight. They wrapped the suitcase in extra plastic and duct tape, trying to contain the liquid that was already beginning to seep through the seams. They were checking out of the St. Regis, but only two of them would be walking through the lobby. Sheila was now just cargo, a heavy, stained secret that they needed to disappear before the Bali sun rose over the horizon. Throughout the night, they moved with a detached, chilling efficiency. They cleaned themselves up, changing into fresh clothes as if they hadn't just spent the last 3 hours mangling a corpse. They whispered about their escape, about the life they would lead once they were back in the States with the trust fund finally in their grasp. They had convinced themselves that they were the victims, that Sheila had forced their hand, and that the silver suitcase was simply the final price of their freedom. As the first light of dawn began to touch the palm trees outside, the couple looked around the ruined suite one last time. They grabbed their bags, gripped the handle of the silver suitcase, and headed for the elevator. They moved through the halls where other guests were still sleeping, past the night staff who offered polite nods, and into the humid morning air. They were two young lovers on vacation, hauling their luggage toward a waiting taxi, carrying the battered remains of the woman who had paid for their front row seat to her own murder. The morning air at the St. Regis was already beginning to shimmer with a heavy, oppressive heat when the elevator doors slid open at approximately 6 a.m. There was no fanfare, no final goodbye to the luxury they had inhabited, only the rhythmic, metallic clicking of a suitcase's wheels against the polished marble floor. To any casual observer, the young couple looked like typical tourists making an early break for the airport. But the weight of their luggage told a different story. CCTV footage from the resort's lobby would later become a centerpiece of the global fascination with the case, capturing a chillingly mundane series of events. It showed the pair struggling with a massive silver suitcase, the kind designed for long-haul international travel, now seemingly overstuffed beyond its capacity. The movements were jerky, uncoordinated. The physics of the bag didn't make sense for a collection of resort wear and souvenirs. Every time the wheels hit a grout line in the stone, the entire frame of the suitcase shuddered. They approached a taxi driven by Iketut Kiana, a man who had spent years navigating the high-end tourist traffic of Nusa Dua. He later noted the sheer desperation in their haste. The young man, dressed in a white shirt and dark shorts, seemed frantic to get the silver suitcase into the trunk. When the driver moved to help, as was the standard of service at a 5-star establishment, he was struck by the impossible density of the cargo. It wasn't just heavy, it was solid, it was dead weight. As the trunk lid was slammed shut, the driver noticed a dark, viscous stain beginning to spread across the light-colored fabric of the suitcase's exterior. It was a deep, brownish-red liquid, seeping through the teeth of the zipper and dripping onto the pavement. The smell, even in the open air, was beginning to shift from the sweet scent of the resort's gardens to something metallic and cloying. Before the taxi could even pull away, the couple's narrative began to fracture. They told the driver they had forgotten their passports back in the room and instructed him to wait at the curb while they went back inside to retrieve them. It was a classic suitcase gambit, a way to distance themselves from the evidence without actually being seen abandoning it. They disappeared into the hotel's sprawling complex, moving not toward the elevators, but toward the service exits and the beach. Back in the taxi, the driver sat in the mounting heat. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The suspicion that had been a quiet hum in the back of his mind grew into a roar. He alerted the hotel's security team, who were already on high alert for a different reason. Housekeeping staff, entering Suite 317 to prepare it for the next guest, had found a scene that defied the resort's sanitized reputation. There was blood on the walls, blood soaked into the white linens, and towels that had been used in a futile attempt to scrub away a slaughter. The resort's security didn't wait. They called the local police, and within the hour, the St. Regis was swarming with officers. The focus immediately turned to the silver suitcase sitting in the trunk of the idling taxi. When the police finally unzipped the luggage, the reality of what had transpired in the early hours of the morning was laid bare. The suitcase didn't just contain the remains of a woman, it contained a gruesome puzzle of human anatomy. The victim had been folded into a shape no living person could maintain. Her limbs forced into a fetal position that had caused her bones to snap and her joints to dislocate. The sheer force required to compress a 62-year-old woman into that space was a testament to the adrenaline and the cold-blooded resolve of her killers. While forensic teams began the grim task of processing the body, the manhunt for the suitcase killers moved into the chaotic, neon-lit streets of Kuta, a world away from the refined silence of Nusa Dua. The couple had shed their high-end personas and were now moving like cornered animals through the low-rent motels and surf shops. They were caught in a paradox. They had the freedom they had killed for, but they had nowhere to go. Their faces were already being broadcast on every news screen in Indonesia. The search ended at the Risata Bali Resort, a significantly more modest hotel near the airport. It wasn't a sophisticated hideout. They had checked in under false names, but their American accents and their visible state of distress made them stand out like flares in the night. When the police moved in, they didn't find a defiant couple. They found two teenagers who seemed to have finally realized that the world they had tried to build on a foundation of blood was collapsing. They were found in a dimly lit room, reportedly sleeping or staring at the walls in a state of shock. There was no struggle during the arrest. The pair was handcuffed and led through a gauntlet of flashbulbs and shouting reporters. As they were pushed into the back of a police van, the image of the heiress in handcuffs became the defining visual of the case. The search was over, but the investigation into the how and why was only just beginning, as the authorities began to peel back the layers of a conspiracy that had started in the quiet suburbs of Chicago and ended in a silver suitcase on the other side of the planet. The local community in Bali was left reeling. In a culture where the dead are treated with profound ritual and respect, the idea of a daughter stuffing her mother into a piece of luggage was a spiritual affront that many couldn't comprehend. The fear wasn't of the criminals themselves, who were now safely behind bars, but of the sheer, hollow void of empathy that the crime represented. The investigation would soon move from the physical evidence of the suitcase to the digital evidence left behind, revealing that while the murder happened in an instant, the plan had been months in the making. The interrogation rooms at Polda Bali are a far cry from the marble hallways of the St. Regis. They are small concrete boxes where the air is stagnant, and the only sound is the persistent low hum of a struggling air conditioner. It was here that the investigation into the death of Sheila von Wiese-Mack truly began, amidst the smell of strong coffee and the pungent, sweet aroma of clove cigarettes favored by the local detectives. Heather Mack and Tommy Schaefer sat in separate rooms, their faces illuminated by the harsh, flickering light of the precinct, as the reality of their situation began to settle like silt at the bottom of a river. The initial phase of the investigation was defined by a series of desperate, shifting narratives, the red herrings, that investigators had to painstakingly dismantle. Tommy was the first to spin a tale of terror. He told the Balinese officers that an armed gang had broken into Suite 317, claiming that he and Heather had been held at gunpoint and forced to witness a robbery gone wrong. He spoke of masked men and a violent struggle, attempting to cast himself and his girlfriend as victims of Indonesia's criminal underworld. It was a story designed to play on the fears of foreign tourists, but for the seasoned detectives in Denpasar, it lacked the weight of truth. There were no signs of forced entry, no other guests had reported a disturbance, and the CCTV footage told a much more damning story of two people calmly hauling a suitcase through a lobby. Heather's own version of events was equally fragmented. She initially maintained a wall of silence, her eyes darting around the room with a mixture of defiance and genuine terror. When she did speak, she attempted to distance herself from the physical act, portraying herself as a terrified daughter who had been trapped in the room while Tommy lost control. She described a scene of chaos and domestic explosion, but she couldn't explain why they hadn't called for help or why they had spent hours cleaning the suite and meticulously packing her mother into a piece of luggage. The breakthrough came not through a confession, but through the clinical, unyielding world of digital forensics. While the couple sat in their cells, Indonesian authorities collaborated with the FBI to gain access to the cell phones recovered from the scene. What they found was the smoking gun that transformed a heat-of-the-moment tragedy into a cold-blooded conspiracy. There were over 1,000 text messages exchanged between Heather and Tommy in the weeks leading up to the trip. These weren't the messages of two lovers. They were the blueprints of killers. The investigators read as Heather complained about her mother's control, referring to her as an obstacle that needed to be removed. They saw Tommy's responses, which were filled with a terrifying, hollow pragmatism. He asked about the trust fund. He asked about the best way to get it done. And he discussed the logistics of a murder as if he were planning a business merger. One particularly chilling message from Heather told Tommy that she was not joking about wanting her mother dead, that she was ready for the life that would follow. The digital trail revealed that Tommy's flight to Bali had been a deliberate move in a long-range plan, and that the reconciliation trip was nothing more than a trap. As the investigation solidified, the couple was moved to Karabokan Prison, locally known as Hotel K. It is a place of legend and nightmare, an overcrowded fortress where the scent of spicy food mingles with the stench of open sewers and the damp heat of the Indonesian rainy season. For Heather, the investigation took a deeply complex turn when it was confirmed that she was pregnant. The suitcase killer was about to become a mother in one of the most notorious prisons in the world. The birth of her daughter, Stella, in 2015 changed the optics of the case, but not the facts. Heather was allowed to keep the infant with her in the prison cell for the first 2 years, a common practice in Indonesia. The image of the young, white heiress navigating the cramped, dangerous world of Karabokan with a baby on her hip became a global sensation. To some, it was a story of redemption and maternal struggle. To the investigators, it was a tactical distraction. They watched as Heather seemingly adapted to prison life, reportedly rising in the internal social hierarchy of the women's wing, while her legal team fought a losing battle against the mounting evidence. Back in Chicago, the FBI was not content to let the Indonesian legal system have the final word. While the Bali court eventually sentenced Heather to 10 years and Tommy to 18 years for premeditated murder, American investigators were building their own case. They weren't looking at the murder itself, which fell under Indonesian jurisdiction, but at the conspiracy to commit murder against a U.S. citizen abroad. They continued to interview friends in Oak Park. They traced the money trail from Sheila's bank accounts. And they waited. The rumors inside Karabokan spoke of a woman who didn't just survive, but thrived. She was described as having a certain command over the other inmates, using what was left of her family's notoriety to carve out a position of relative comfort. Meanwhile, in the suburbs of Chicago, the social echo was one of profound betrayal. Former friends of Sheila von Wiese-Mack gathered in quiet living rooms, trying to reconcile the image of the bright academic woman they knew with the gruesome reality of her end. They spoke of the warning signs they had missed, the 911 calls they had ignored, and the terrifying reality that the girl they had seen at garden parties was capable of such a hollow, calculated act. The final stage of the international investigation was a game of patience. For 7 years, the US government monitored Heather's time in Karabokan, gathering every scrap of evidence that could be used once she stepped back onto American soil. When she was released early for good behavior in 2021, the transition was a masterclass in law enforcement coordination. As Heather was escorted onto a flight back to the United States, Stella in tow, the FBI was waiting at the gate in Chicago. The investigation that had started in a humid police precinct in Denpasar had come full circle, and the queen of the prison was about to find out that the American justice system had a very long memory. When the wheels of the commercial jet touched down at O'Hare in 2021, the illusion of freedom vanished before the cabin doors even opened. Federal agents moved with a practiced, silent efficiency, boarding the aircraft to intercept the suitcase killer before she could take a single breath of American air. The transition from the lawless, humid cells of Karabokan to the sterile, pressurized reality of a US federal facility was a jarring, final shift in her world. The United States government had little interest in the time she had served for the murder itself. They were instead prosecuting the cold-blooded conspiracy that had been hatched in the quiet living rooms of Oak Park. For 3 years, the legal machinery ground forward until January 2024, when the gavel finally came down with the weight of a decade's worth of blood. A judge in Chicago looked past the polished defense, sentencing Heather Mack to 26 years in federal prison. The court declared that she had treated her mother's life like a simple commercial transaction, a hurdle between her and $1 million fantasy. She had spent a decade running, but in that courtroom, the price of the silver suitcase had finally come due. Sheila von Wiese-Mack didn't just lose her life. She lost the legacy she spent decades building for the daughter she once called a miracle. The $1.5 million trust she guarded so fiercely is gone, swallowed by legal fees and the sterile walls of a federal cell. Heather Mack finally has her independence, but it is the hollow, echoing autonomy of a prisoner. The silver suitcase remains a monument to a bloodline severed by greed, proving that in her quest for everything, she ended up with nothing. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.